and thank you for joining us for our July 18th Housing and Neighborhood Development Committee meeting. We always like to start off by giving you an opportunity to say your name and either department and or community, neighborhood, or organization that you're representing today, even if it is community member. Don't have to be associated, but I would love to start to my far right, the beautiful young lady by the door.
Hey, my name is Destiny, and I'm an intern with Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Welcome, Ms. Destiny.
I'm Zelica Bateman. I'm with Housing Services.
I'm Gabriel Cartagena. I am a student.
Paul Ballman, Crossland Southeast.
Shannon Henson, Habitat, Charlotte.
Ryan Carter, Habitat, Charlotte.
Sharice Blackman, Westside Community Land Trust.
Madeline Keeter with Rebic.
Anna Schloinis, City Attorney's Office. Anna Braunberger, Strategy and Budget.
Ward Wooten, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Miles Vaughn, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
And then I'm going to jump across the room to the beautiful young lady by the door.
Bronson Jacobs, Monday, Affordable Housing.
I'm Ken Saminsky, Greater Charlotte Apartment Association.
Jean Busby, Action NC.
Priscilla Stowe, Action NC.
Kathy Stillwell,
Ashton Slater, Housing Partnership.
Karen Wisher, City Manager's Office.
Keith Richardson, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Katrina Page, Habitat.
Robert Dawkins, Action NC.
Lowell Faison, Action NC.
Andrew Ford, Human Services Network.
Sam Todd, Carolina Jews for Justice.
Paula McDaniel, Charlotte Fire.
Shantae Adams, Charlotte Housing Authority.
Pam Whiteman, Housing and Neighborhoods.
Deborah Campbell, City Manager's Office.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Member.
I am Luana Mayfield. I serve as your chair.
Ed Triggs, Committee Member.
Matt Newton, Committee Member, District 5.
Justin Harlow, Committee Member. Come on, Gail. Come on. I'm Gail.
I am Gail with Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Thank you all so very much. And we are actually going to jump right in. So I am turning it over to our Director of Housing and Neighborhood Services, Ms. Pam Whiten.
Thank you, Ms. Mayfield, and thank you for committee. Hope you guys are enjoying your summer. I promise to be efficient today and use your time wisely. What I will say is the only item on our agenda is your housing locational policy. You've talked about it a couple of times, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on kind of history and background unless you all want me to. I would like to say to the room, we have a great crowd today. There will be lots of community engagement involved in this process, so you will get to share your input, but as appropriate, we wanted to start with the council as well. A couple of the things that we're going to talk about today. Like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the background. I do want to remind you of your goals, how this policy applies, and what we're proposing as exemptions to the policy. I want to present to you two options that will come back to you, that hopefully you will give me a recommendation on at a later meeting, and then we want to talk about how we want to proceed during the month of August. So just a little bit about the current policy. It was approved in 2011. Ms. Mayfield and Mr. Driggs, you guys may remember this. You were around the table, and some of you all may have been involved in the community engagement process in 2011. The current policy applies to new construction for households earning 60% and below. The council agreed that rehabilitation was good anywhere, that there was a bit of preservation there. And then there was this notion of conversion. I will tell you that conversion has never happened, but the thought at that time was if somebody was converting what was currently privately owned market rate apartments, that they could convert up to 50% of that for affordable housing. Again, that's never happened. What has happened is we've seen those become out of reach. They didn't remain affordable housing. They either got torn down and redeveloped into high-end housing, or they got rehabbed into high-end housing with no long-term deed restrictions. Again, we lost those to our affordable housing stock. The current policy creates permissible and
Just a quick question.
Yes, sir.
That policy, as established then, related only to rental properties.
Yes, sir. That's right, Mr. Driggs. Thank you. Thank you so much. It didn't relate to single family, because we believe that single family is also important to a neighborhood or neighborhoods, and it's home ownership. It's the way that people create wealth. So that policy only applied to multifamily. What we're proposing to you today only applies to multifamily. The policy created permissible and non-permissible areas, and what I'll point out here, again, that policy was based on neighborhood statistical areas, which were larger groups of census tracts, and it reflected the geography of the quality of life at that time. Since 2011, we've redefined how we do the quality of life based on neighborhood input. We have neighborhood profile areas now which mimic or reflect truer neighborhood boundaries. And again, that was at the community's input. And so those are neighborhood profile areas. And so that's what the new policy will be based on. And then in the old policy, you, the council, you all have permission to grant waivers, and you've done that. You've granted about 20 waivers since the inception of the policy, and you've had to do that because the community is changing, right? So you need affordable housing in areas that are gentrifying, and so you've had to approve waivers to your own policy. So that was 2011. Fast forward to 2017. The policy was referred to the committee for an update. The committee review began in November. Under a previous council. You had an election, and then so you have a new council. So we need to look at the policy under a new council. You have discussed this policy 3 times so far in a committee meeting. You've discussed it in February, March, and April. I'll also remind you all that you remember you did your short-term, medium-term, and long-term things at your January retreat. You said this is one of the things that you want to get done. And then the policy is also called out in your Housing Charlotte framework that I'll be presenting to the full council at your meeting on Monday, July 23rd, as one of the policies that needs to be updated. And I emphasize it's just one of the policies that needs to be updated. Again, you've granted 20 waivers since 2001, and that's the beginning. That's when the trust fund started in 2001. So why are we updating the policy? It's outdated. I've said this. It's prohibitive to where you need new affordable housing now, and it does not reflect the current environment, what's going on throughout our city. And again, it's one of the key strategies in the Housing Charlotte framework. So we've talked about this a number of times, and based on your feedback, and I want you guys to reaffirm these for me or tell me if we missed something. You've said your goals are you want to, and this is all consistent with kind of leading on opportunity, pathways to opportunity, areas of high income. You've said you want affordable and workforce housing to be near employment centers, commercial centers, transit services, TOD. Particularly, I want to highlight that near center city, in neighborhoods experiencing change. That's your gentrification. You want it to support the city's revitalization efforts, and that overall you guys want to promote diverse and inclusive neighborhoods.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So you were asking if there was anything that we would maybe exclude or include. I would say that from the standpoint of diverse neighborhoods, I think we've talked a lot about diverse communities. We talk about mixed income communities, which I think is much broader than just the concept of an individual or maybe a small collection of neighborhoods. I would ask that there be some consideration given to the concept of diverse communities. At the same time, too, some emphasis potentially on nutrition options in a particular area. Which I think maybe we see in federal guidelines, but I mean, so would that be included in commercial centers, nutrition, and then banking? I know in my district I've had constituents reach out to me and say we don't have a bank anywhere close to us, so maybe even financial kind of banking centers. So I don't know if that is all inclusive within the concept of commercial centers, but maybe if not, if it could be, or alternatively, maybe mentioned elsewhere.
Yeah, and I believe that the first part of your question actually is covered under neighborhoods experiencing change, because that's where we're seeing the differing in the diversifying of communities. So I believe that the neighborhoods experiencing change encompasses that.
And to kind of maybe clarify my point too, so my concern is oftentimes I feel like when we talk about mixed income communities, diversity within a neighborhood, we're always talking about diversity below, right, the 80% AMI mark, as opposed to true diversity, which I think would incorporate everything, right? And then again, too, I think maybe from the standpoint of creating true mixed income communities, provide more opportunities for folks that, are say 80% or below.
So Mr. Newton, points well taken, and we're going to talk about some of that as I step through it, but points well taken. So how will this policy apply? We know, and we've had a number of conversations around this table and just with you individually, the 9% tax credit deals that you guys have diligently approved since the inception of the trust fund, those deals, the state, they rewrite they have a thing called their qualified allocation plan. And that's kind of the scorecard that developers who are competing for 9%, that's what they have to follow, right? We know we're only going to get 3 of those deals per year based on our fair share. In that qualified allocation plan, it already steers developments that will win, that will get tax credits toward areas of lower poverty, the census tract, right? The allocation plan says that they have to, the census tract has to be below 10% of the poverty rating. So that's taken care of there, right? And you're only going to get 3. So we are proposing that this policy only apply to new 4% subsidized deals. And I'll tell you why that's, staff, we believe that's important. We know we anticipate having a larger bond this year. We're going to be oversubscribed, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We just know with the resources that we have, there's going to be a finite number of 4% deals that you can approve per bond cycle, right? And so what we're trying to say, we're not trying to discourage that at all. Again, 4%, it's a way to get new quality affordable on the ground. But we're trying to say to you, council, you're going to be asked to put more money in those deals, and you understand why that is, and you've done that. This gives you the opportunity to encourage, right? The locational policy should be, it should steer where you want it based on your council goals. And so we're trying to give you a way to do that through the locational policy. We've had, we don't want the locational policy to be seen as punitive. We want it to be seen as a mechanism that we have to steer where we want these types of developments in our community.
So I'm going to ask if we can hold on to comments, because this isn't a very long presentation, and that way we'll have a little bit more time to dig in, because some of the questions might be asked as we go through.
So we're proposing that this only applies to 4% deals for households earning 80% or below the area median income. The 80% is a change, right? So we're trying to reflect changing dynamics. Your current policy says 60% and below, but we're proposing that you go up to 80% and below. And then, as is in your current policy, we are proposing to keep the exemption. And the exemption is for elderly, the senior households, and you've seen the stats. Senior households are expected to double by 2040, I believe that statistic is. And then for disabled population. So those 2 populations would be exempt in this policy as they are in your current policy. So, option number 1, again, we're going to give you 2 options, right? The first option will be to eliminate the locational policy altogether. And the objective here is to provide the greatest amount of flexibility for creating new affordable housing. And so you can see your strengths and your weaknesses here. What I would point out to you is, obviously, it recognizes the broad need for affordable housing throughout the city. It enables us, it helps, you could argue it helps eliminate the stigma of affordable housing. It's bad. And I point that out is because you'll remember, if we go back to when this policy was first developed, it was developed around public housing when we were trying to do scattered site. That was all 30% and below. It's not built that way anymore. It would enable development in neighborhoods that are experiencing change. investment decisions would be made on the basis of the merits of each development proposal. You still will review each proposal as you currently do and make a decision. Under this, you wouldn't need any waivers because you wouldn't have any housing locational policy. The two weaknesses that I do want to point out to you is that you don't have a locational policy, so people could theoretically develop in areas that the community believes are already heavily concentrated. And then one of the weaknesses is that there is still a public perception of affordable housing, particularly in areas with existing or subsidized development. So all that's still about that there still be a stigma, could still be a stigma around affordable housing. So option two would be to update the geography based on NPAs and today's current environment, the number of subsidized housing in the community, in the city, divided by the number of subsidized housing in any NPA. So that's what we would come back to you with that threshold. Your current policy says we shouldn't have any more than 15% of subsidized housing in any one NSA. We would update that based on the NPA. But what we would also add is a scorecard, a scoring criteria. And you guys have talked about this at your retreat. You've talked about this a little bit around the table. And again, this would help stir your investment to where you believe we need more affordable housing, and it would also be consistent with your goals. So what we believe your goals are, again, I've talked a little bit about this earlier, is to reduce concentrations of poverty. You want to address neighborhood change or gentrification. You want to encourage proximity to TOD. You want to encourage proximity to job centers, and you want to encourage income targeting. And what I mean by income targeting is we hear a lot about we're not doing enough 30%, and so this you could award points based on a scoring system related to the unit mix in the proposed development. And so the objectives promote a mix of housing options within neighborhoods, geographic dispersion. Number 3 is really important. You want to encourage this near existing and proposed transit services and in areas of high opportunity like job centers. That brings in your economic development. Strengths and weaknesses here. We believe that this is simple, more simple to the community, more simple to the development community. You're either permissible or you're not. We know that you're going to be oversubscribed, and so you will have a way to evaluate those developments that are permissible. All of them might not be awarded, but you could say, based on the merits, we're going to award, I'm making this up, 3 of the 7 that you might get that are in permissible areas. You would still, if you so choose, if we got 10 proposals and 2 were non-permissible, you would still have the ability to grant a waiver if you so choose to. But we believe this is simpler and clearer for you, for the community, for the development community. The development community has said, Pam, we just want transparency. We want to know what sites you're looking for, what sites you're not looking for, where do you want them, where don't you want them. So that's one of the benefits here. Some of these are the same as on the other one. I would point out to you, this scoring system would take into consideration unique attributes of each development. It would provide for you, again, a tool to better inform your housing investment decisions. Again, it aligns with your priorities, and you would still look at each project like you do today. And this is for us, and so it's not for you to worry about. We would need to update the data, the boundaries at certain intervals, and then you could still need to do a waiver. You could choose to do a waiver for those that are non-permissible if you chose to. So let's talk about what the scoring might look like. And we've got to bring you some more data back on kind of what the sources we would use, but this is our preliminary thinking that we want to share with you.
So Pam, before we get into the option of site scoring, I want to pause right here because now we're getting ready to move a little quicker. Mr. Newton, I know you had a question.
Yeah, no, I had a clarifying question from before, which is maybe more informational than anything else. On the slide where it says applicability and exemptions, which I don't know what number that is.
There you go.
Yeah, that one right there. Yeah, so on that particular slide, you're saying that the policy only applies to new 4% subsidized multifamily. I'm wondering, and I don't know if this has ever been the case, can a developer apply for both 9 and 4 at the same time? It seems like in my experience, we've only seen one or the other. And I think, oftentimes we're waiting to hear back, is it from Raleigh on whether or not the 9% are going to be accepted? And I feel like that has, maybe we could include an option there or something where then we're kind of catching some of those that are then, falling out of the mix altogether.
I mean, a developer theoretically could do that, Mr. Newton. I don't know that a developer will because, number one, it costs money to apply to the state. And then the state is probably going to look at that and say, well, if you can apply for 4%, those are non-competitive. The state is probably going to push you into that. So I think they make a decision one or the other, but I don't know, and I can follow up with that. I don't know that there's anything that prohibits them for,
Okay.
But what that would put you in a position, and so I just want you guys to be aware of, you would theoretically, if that happened, you would be saying, I'm going to fund X number for this 9% or X number for this 4%. But let me make sure, let me test that with some members of the development.
It's a
Ms.
completely
White,
different deal.
Mr.
I
Sir.
just wanted to say, it's a very different deal.
Yeah,
You're structured
yeah.
for the 9%, the 30% component,
Yeah.
the capital stack, very different. So you want to try for that because that offers by far the greater
Sure.
benefit and gives you the opportunity for 30%.
Yeah.
But you're going to regroup and come up with a whole new plan if you don't get it.
That's right.
And nothing's ever prevented, so just follow up, nothing's ever prevented anybody from coming back and trying for a 4% after not receiving a 9.
Yeah. And that's exactly
that's not this.
That's exactly what this is intended, though, Mr. Newton. So you raise a great point. So we want to steer, and I think developers, if they had their druthers, they want to get the 9% tax credit because it brings more equity to the deal, right? But what we recognize, and when we talk about your framework again on Monday night, this notion of the equity fund, that was one of the premises for an equity fund, right? We know we have a big need in this community for affordable housing, right? We know that we only get 3 deals from the 9%. And so the question became, what if there were a way that we know those 9%, they score well, they're theoretically good deals, right? What if there were a way that, to Mr. Driggs's point, they could be restructured in a way that they become 4% deals? The thing that we have to address is that they require more money. So we want to push good sites toward the 9%, process, but we know every site won't win that way. So I hope that helps.
Ms. Wyman, we also have a question from Dr. Harlow and
Sure.
Mr. Eggleston.
So to appreciate it, could you, I thought I wrote it down. You said, so my question has more to do with the waivers. I certainly believe we need a policy, no question. But we haven't seen an option that says, I mean, in your weakness box on option 2, it says it would require a waiver for proposed in non-permissible sites. And maybe some historical context for you two that have been here, and I guess from a staff standpoint, in 2011, what was the conversation around the need for waivers? I mean, if we really get serious and say we want to try to drive these, have a little bit of say in where these things really go, why would we need a waiver at all?
Yeah.
Why would we need a way out, if you will?
I'm going to let Ms. Whiteman answer that question.
Mr. Driggs, you perked up. Would you like to go before me?
That's why I directed the question to Ms. Wyman,
The
to
chair has invited you
the
to speak.
director.
So, based on my recollection, the council wanted to, at that time, that council wanted the ability to have an option to grant a waiver if they so chose to do that.
I was just going to say, it's very hard to come up with a one-size-fits-all strategy
Yeah.
to cover all circumstances. So you didn't want to lock yourself in, and you needed an escape valve in case judgment told you that the policy wasn't really right.
Or if we saw what we've seen recently, and that's a different level of growth and investment, because you also have to remember that was still on the tail end of a decline in our community, even though we weren't hit as hard as many other communities. There was a different mindset of previous council regarding how we continue to have growth. in our city.
So what's our data on the, you mentioned earlier, I didn't write it down, so what?
We've granted 20 waivers since 2001. Now, I can go back and I can send to you guys, and I should have brought this as back pocket, I can tell you in each year how many waivers you granted. We have it broken down by year.
We also have it broken down by location?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting to see, because it's, you know, I mean, we clearly know they're in non-permissible areas based on this old kind of NSA format, but I'd want to get a little even more granular and say, where specifically?
Yeah.
You know, we whispered about Mount Island earlier, and that was, you know, one of the first affordable decisions we had on this council, and that needed a waiver.
Yeah.
And so as we're just thinking about, you know, what some of the criteria that I think, you know, we all agree on, and we've had a lot of collaboration on, as it relates to where we want it or what we want around it. But, you know, I'd be interested to see that first before making a different decision about are waivers even needed. And I get the concept of not locking us in and creating a way out, but I don't know, if there's always a way out and we just are giving it, then we're not helping the problem that we're trying to solve.
Councilmember Tarlow, I'll tell you 3 specific examples come to mind. You had to grant a waiver in Cherry, right? Cherry is gentrifying. Right?
Sure.
You had to grant 2. You had to grant one for the Tall Elks redevelopment, and you had to grant one for Baxter Street, where you use your own land. You had to grant a waiver in Belmont, right, where gentrification is occurring. It's close to job centers. It's close to Center City. You had to grant a waiver in Ms. Mayfield. I can't remember the name of the development, but it wasn't that this development wasn't asking you for money. It was close to an existing naturally occurring, right? Ashley Park, Deborah, you had to grant a waiver there. It's gentrifying. You could argue it's close to the uptown, close to job centers. So this gives us an opportunity, staff and you, to respond to the changing dynamics kind of more so in real time based on what we're seeing. And we don't necessarily have to wait till the census data catches up, right?
Right. Mr. Eggleston had a question.
One last follow-up, sorry.
So before you go there, Ms. Campbell, you had wanted to.
I just wanted to maybe add on to the rationale for a waiver is if you think about a revitalization strategy for a community. If it needs a revitalization, it probably has a bit of a concentration of poverty.
Sure. And
so you would literally have to get a waiver as part of your city priority to go into this neighborhood to add affordable housing. So to partner with a developer, if the city said, we want to go in Thomasboro Hoskins, or we're going to go in Lakewood, or we want to go into some of those areas that are non-permissible, and we want to redevelop it, we have to get a waiver ourselves. And so I think it is, you know, we wanted to make sure that we were not creating this entree for people to just rush in, but that we had more control over, yes, this is the type of development that we want to go into this neighborhood.
So, okay, so that makes better sense as saying, hey, in real time, neighborhoods change, neighborhoods gentrify, and so to capture some of that housing stock on the front end before it gets too expensive, I get that. So what's our criteria for what's gentrifying and what isn't, or what's gentrified enough?
Yeah, and so that's the source, Dr. Harlow. We've got to figure out from a staff perspective what the appropriate source should be, and we need to bring that back to you. A definition around gentrification. HUD has a definition of high opportunity areas, but that's information that we owe you. We just wanted to start by saying, are you okay with these criteria? Is it okay for us to dig in a little more?
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Eggleston.
A comment and a question, and y'all started to hit on my comment there, which is, I think the waiver is valuable because it allows us to look at where the puck is going, not just where the puck is. And that might be hard to quantify, but I don't necessarily need data to look at the Belmont community in my district and know that we need to lock in affordability there, because we are losing it at a rapid pace. So I think it's a valuable tool in that regard. But I wonder in terms of the idea of eliminating the locational policy, would it be staff's opinion that the $50 million that I think we're all confident will be in this piggy bank at the end of but the voters will approve, do you think if we maintain our locational policy and make some updates to it, do you think we're not going to have enough people coming to us with deals within the confines of that policy to deploy those dollars and get that affordability that we need? Because if you think we will, I don't see what the incentive is to eliminate the locational policy that gives some people guideposts and says, we realize that in the Belmont community, there might be an exception, but more often than not, these are your guiding principles on the deals we want to see. I can only imagine us undoing the locational policy if we felt like people weren't going to bring enough stuff to the table for us to deploy those dollars.
I think it's the latter, Mr. Eggleston. I think the option 2 gives you a way to target your limited 50 million. The 50 million will go fast. And so I think it gives you a way to target the investment in a way that it meets the community and your council's goals. I think you will be oversubscribed. Yeah.
I kind of agree, which is why that gives me some heartburn. Because I don't think,
which is why we have much more information in option 2. Did you have a follow-up?
No,
Mr. Newton and then Mr. Driggs.
Yeah, I think we're acknowledging, so in option 2, we're acknowledging times change.
That's right.
And that's why we know that the census tract framework is outdated. We need to be much more targeted. And so in that regard, I think maybe kind of addressing this idea of waivers, we're also, so the prior council might have acknowledged times might change. Now, having said that, I hear my fellow councilmen, and I guess maybe kind of the line of questioning and the reasoning being that with 20 locational waivers over the years, did we ever effectively maybe have a locational policy in the first place? I think we did, right? And so I wouldn't say that's kind of an outcome determinative factor for me. My concerns with the elimination of a locational policy is that we would effectively be opening floodgates for developers, maybe providing them more of a windfall, maybe providing more of a gap in that respect between haves and have-nots, where they're going to target the locations that maybe the land values are the cheapest, and I think maybe for a specific reason, and then take off many of the protections that are otherwise afforded to our community, right? And its opportunity for upward mobility, which is, I think, one of the things we've been trying to champion as a council, over the years. So I'm a big fan of option 2, maintaining a locational policy that's much more targeted. And in that regard, too, I think I wouldn't be doing my job, and I know I've been harping on this, but when we talk about this site scoring components, I really appreciate the inclusion of job centers. We've discussed that, since our retreat back in, I think it was, February or so?
Are you jumping ahead?
No, I'm addressing, so one of these slides where we were being told about what the site scoring components would be, it includes job centers. I just feel like I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't also reiterate, I think, the need, maybe even exclusive, of some other grander component, unless it's otherwise broken down within it, for things like nutrition centers and financial centers.
And so that's coming forward for those of you that are in the audience, because we still have 5 more slides, so we're going to get to that. But Mr. Driggs.
And one more follow-up too. So from the standpoint of concentration, I'd like to know more about the geographic region of concentration. If it's just the neighborhood, or if it's the greater region, and to what extent the greater region.
We're looking at the MPA. But Mr. Newton, you made me think of something really important. So this is one component. We will always, and I think this is, as your staff, you want us to do this. We always have to look at things like developer experience. We will also always look at the financial feasibility of the deal, because we don't want you putting dollars towards something that's not financially feasible. And we are introducing a site scoring component. So I don't want to leave those 2 things out.
Mr. Driggs had a follow-up?
Just a quick question. When you talk about 20 waivers, could you tell us now or subsequently how many deals in total there were, and therefore what the relative incidence was?
Sure.
And the other thing I just wanted to say quickly was, I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where we have no regard to location whatsoever. And as soon as we do take it into account, we have to get back to what is the framework for, so I think we kind of have to move towards option 2, and it's just a question of designing it right.
Sure. Of which we have 5 slides on option 2 that we're going to go through, but before we move forward with that, Mr. Bakari had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in the realm of thinking big and differently, like we've all kind of challenged ourselves to do, the one thing that always bothered me a little bit about the locational policy, which I understand the reason for it, is in a world where we're trying to go after number of units and the right locations for upward mobility, it feels like the whole thing is centered around where you can't go. There's nothing about where we want you to go. So is there anything that we thought, not dollar-based, but like, can we go and say, hey, if you build, 60, 70, 80% AMI affordable units in South Park, that we give you optimal zoning that would enable that to make more sense and be more fiscally viable there? I just, a positive angle, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, so if I am.
Yeah, so.
I was just saying that's contract zoning. We couldn't do that, but we can, you're saying some kind of incentive.
Well, could we not change through the UDO almost in the same way that we target areas where we don't allow certain types of deals, land use to be done in that we promote other types based on what we want and let the market figure it out?
In the district itself, not on an individual decision perspective.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's what I mean. Not individual deal based. I mean, here are the rules, anyone who wants to do them, but almost use the same area as the inverse of opportunity zones, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. Madam Chairman, if I could. I think at our earlier meeting with the chairs, it's exactly what we were talking about in terms of the locational housing policy. For so many years, it's been like punitive, thou shalt not go, versus here's where we want to encourage you to go. And I think that's the nuance of this policy in terms of the revisions is we want to try to steer and direct to places where we think are places of opportunity that provide the safety net, all those wraparound services, and most importantly, in geographies that truly create the best opportunity for that person or persons to make the best of themselves. And I think a lot of these geographies, that's why we're kind of going to a lot of the specific geographical locations, because that's where that opportunity best exists.
Okay. And just to add to that, Mr. Bakari, we want this to be positive, right? So we were careful. We want to encourage proximity to transit, encourage proximity to job centers, encourage proximity, encourage income targeting. So again, more of a carrot than a stick. It shouldn't be punitive.
I love the carrot model, and to be honest, I understand how it's important to have a policy statement, but the element of a punitive policy statement that we give a bunch of what is it called, passes, waivers to, it almost feels irrelevant to me. Like, we vote on every single one anyway.
Yeah.
So like, it's really not much of a control other than tell it to us in this one already has it, and there's a lot there. Do you want to do it or not? Rather than us breaking a policy to be flexible.
And what we hope to encourage through this, Mr. Bakari, to your point exactly, is we want to provide transparency to the development community so that hopefully you will have to grant fewer waivers. People know exactly what you are looking for based on your council priorities, and they bring the sites. Now, we won't be able to fund every one of them simply because we have a finite amount of funds, but we want to encourage the opportunity for you to have to approve less waivers. I don't like asking you all to approve a waiver.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
So we talked about kind of what our scoring considerations will be. We've got some work to do on this, but let's just go through it real quick. Proximity, we want to encourage proximity to TOD development and then other amenities. So Mr. Newton, this kind of gets to what you're talking about. Amenities like grocery store.
We need to go back one because we skipped that one.
So this is just
transit oriented, the previous one before this one.
Oh, did we?
So
I'm sorry.
Go forward.
That one.
So
is where we stopped off.
So this is the scoring considerations. I'm going to step through each of these, okay? And so we're going to be looking at proximity, diversity, access, and neighborhood change. And I'm going to talk to you about what each of those mean. So proximity, I don't have a little clicker, but proximity, right? So you could get a maximum of 10 points is what we're thinking. We're looking at the proximity to transit-oriented development, and we want to be consistent. So this whole notion of being consistent across our silos or across our city, we really want to target light rail, right? We've talked a lot about how we don't have affordable near light rail, either the Blue Line or the expansion, or the streetcar expansion. That's not to say we won't consider buses, but we have more bus stops in this community than we do opportunities for, we have more opportunities for folks to live closer to bus stops than we do have opportunities for folks to live closer to transit and streetcar. So we want to encourage that. Amenities, Mr. Newton, this gets to you. Close to grocery stores, parks, recreation centers, financial institutions, and pharmacies. So that's the nutrition and the financial institutions come in. Diversity. We want to talk about diversity in two ways here. We want to talk about it in terms of the unit mix. We've heard a lot about, you've heard a lot about, you're granting a lot of money in 4%. They don't have 30% units in them. Again, we know it has to be financially feasible, but we want to acknowledge what we've heard from our community, and we want to acknowledge kind of the concerns that we've heard from you as well. The poverty rating. We want to encourage these developments to be in areas where the poverty rating is less than 10%. We're not saying you absolutely have to be. We're just saying that's another scoring criteria that we will consider. Jobs. We want to measure access to jobs. We're not sure, we need to do some more digging to see if we want to look at how long it takes you to drive. There's many of these families have cars, right? And how long it takes you to get to major job centers by transit as well. And then we need to do some work on to be consistent with how we are defining job centers.
Right.
So in terms of neighborhood change, this is really about addressing ongoing gentrification or pending gentrification, because we know what is planned in a community. What I will say is you don't have to score well on all of these, and you probably won't score well on all of these. So if you could score differently on any of these four. So the main point is I don't want folks to leave here thinking you have to check the box on all of these. We know some of these developments won't be located in an NPA with less than 10% of the poverty, right? But that's just one opportunity for scoring. That same development might be located in an NPA that is close to a job center, and they might receive a higher scoring. So that's one point that I really, really want to stress here. In terms of next steps.
Go back one.
Okay.
That's what we are.
Neighborhood change, that's gentrification. That's either, like I said, either ongoing gentrification or pending gentrification based on what we know is coming to an NPA.
We're here, I would like to pause. I have both Mr. Newton and Mr. Bakari.
Yeah, so with the poverty rating, is that to be determined, or is that something that has already been determined? Or are you saying 10%, does that mean 10% of the families or households in the area are below the poverty line, or is this something that's determined like Quality of Life Explorer?
So what we know now, Mr. Newton, is with the 9%, again, we said the state steers developers to a census tract where the poverty rating is below 10%. We need to do some more work and make sure we're very clear about how our NPAs line up with the census tract. So we need to bring you back some more. But we're basically, again, this is about deconcentrating poverty.
So it's more in line with the federal definition.
We're trying to make it more in line with the state's definition. Yes.
Okay.
That was basically my same question, but let me just ask it a different way. Is it, in its calculation, is it simply an aggregation of AMI, or is it much more than that?
I don't know the answer to that specifically, Mr. Bakari. Let me bring that information back.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ms. Whiteman, when you're bringing that information back, it will be helpful to also know the differences between what the state is identifying for across the state and what we're seeing locally.
Sure.
Because there is a different impact when we're looking at what is considered the poverty levels. And as communities are gentrifying, we're also seeing the major impact of displacement. One of the many concerns that I have is I don't know anyone out there that's tracking the displacement of those who are currently in a home where you're paying $600 to $900 and you're renting a home.
Right.
That is not accessible today. You're not finding that. So when that home is then purchased and flipped, and that family is now having to relocate, who's tracking those that are being relocated outside of Charlotte-Mecklenburg because of the housing costs, and how are we maintaining that? So that would be helpful to know, so that when we are looking at legislative policy and our legislative agenda, if we need to have a different conversation around how we're able to have flexibility to address the current needs, it will be helpful to have that data available for what is happening in Charlotte, because it is very different what we're seeing versus what is happening in Asheville or Buncombe or even Greenville.
Sure.
Mr. Newton.
From the standpoint of creating expectations for developers and encouraging them, I feel like, and then maybe even from the standpoint of, you know, those expectations maybe saving them money too. So, you know, on their side being beneficial, I think our current policy that has a map where everything's kind of drawn out and everyone can clearly see what's permissible, what's not, helps. Would there be a map associated with this?
Absolutely, Mr. Newton, and that was my next point, so thank you. So, no, you're fine. So today, no, this is great. We have a map, an old map, a map that's based on the old policy, again, NSAs, and it shows the permissible and the non-permissible areas. What we have to do is update that map based on NPAs and current data. I will tell you now that you're going to have fewer permissible areas based on the current dynamics, the new data, and we will show you that map when we bring this back to you. But just know that you're going to have fewer permissible, fewer non-permissible, fewer non-permissible areas. Y'all didn't.
Just gave her a minute. She was going to.
Y'all checking to see if you were listening, right?
I was listening to myself, right? Fewer
would and wouldn't.
Fewer non-permissible areas.
Wouldn't.
Would not.
Too soon.
It's important not to take yourself too seriously, right?
Here.
You will have fewer non-permissible areas based on the current dynamics. So just know that, okay?
No, I was just processing. I'm glad she clarified, because I had missed the whole.
If she hadn't, I was.
My brain works faster than my mouth. Anyway,
we got your back.
So thank you. So next steps, like I said, we believe wholeheartedly that community engagement is very important.
So what does that look like? Because remember earlier this year, City instituted the Meet Needs.
Yep.
And that was very successful on a number of different areas because it was spread throughout. And we have a very large, diverse, growing community. So it will be helpful to share what that community engagement is going to look like.
Thank you, Ms. Whitfield. So I'll tell you what we did last time, and I think it was very effective, and you may remember this, Ms. Mayfield and Mr. Driggs, and some of you all too. We had 5 community engagement sessions, right? We divided the city in 4 quadrants. We had north, south, east, and west, and then we had a final one in the central region. We had it right here in this building. So for anybody that couldn't come to the one in their region, we did that. And so I would propose something very similar to that. I'm also trying to balance that with, I know we've been talking about this policy for a long time, and it is our goal, if you see this, September, we want to bring back kind of some proposed revisions based on what you either tell us today and what we hear from the community. So long story short, the plan is to use the month of August for community engagement sessions. Now, I won't promise you that we can get all 5 done in August, but we will work like heck to get them done. So they might bleed over into September, but we really, really want to get this to the full council for review and approval no later than October. So that's kind of the path forward for this. And so I know I've said a lot, and I've probably talked fast. That's the presentation that we prepared for you today.
Mr. Dritz.
In terms of steps, September you bring back, so will you circulate before we meet?
Sure, we'll circulate a policy and have the data sources, all the questions that you.
I'm just interested in the number of steps until we get to the point where council is approving it.
Sure.
So this committee has to look at it. It may take 1 or 2 iterations to respond to your draft and to reach the point where we're ready to endorse it. And council has to have as much time as it needs to take it on board as well. So just think about the actual events, you know, like when emails are sent out, what meetings this will be discussed, and make sure that we don't end up where anybody feels at the end like they've been jammed by this.
Yes, sir.
So
Point well
I
taken.
would say create a little bit more flexibility in bullet 3.
Yes.
Opposed to trying to tie ourselves in with October, just to give enough time to truly have the community engagement and give enough time for this committee to have real conversation before the expectation that it's going to go to full council.
Madam Chair, the November date, of course, is an important reference because the marketing campaign for the bonds, if possible, should be supported by a fairly clear statement from us. So I recognize that time constraint. I'm just saying make sure you have enough steps and that nobody feels that they didn't have a chance to participate.
And Ms. Campbell, I don't know what you think about this. I mean, perhaps if we need to do a preview, if you will, with the full council, just to go ahead and start getting the full council involved, maybe that might be appropriate.
And I know we're having trouble scheduling some of our strategy session meetings that you all usually have where the committee is able to provide some updates. We can consider those as well, because I think you are trying to add another meeting, and maybe that's an opportunity. And just for the people in the audience, when we have these engagement meetings, it's not going to be this one meeting where there's a bunch of talking heads, and then we have everybody trying to ask us questions. We'll break out into groups. We'll make this as interactive to provide as many people an opportunity to express their concerns and issues. I know that's how we did it when we did it several years ago, and I think it worked very effectively. Mr. McCarthy?
Just one more piece of input for you guys to consider. So I'd like to personally take some ownership for a meeting or meetings in my district on this, and I would like to not just make it a community dialogue. I think it's maybe a little more unique in my district than maybe some of the other places we go in how we approach it.
Absolutely.
I don't want it to be a review this and tell me where you have problems only. I want it to be a take some ownership. Let's have a discussion now about what are the ways we can make this stuff happen here. And that way, in a safe environment where all of a sudden it's not in a subset of somebody's backyard yet, they're having a dialogue and hopefully can come to an outcome of which we point at that. And then and I will then work after that to further relate to the community. But if we get to a point where a few people defensively look at something and say, I like this, I don't like this, and then the next step is something in their backyard, then I'm not going to win. I mean, they're going to keep fighting and I'll do it. But if we can figure out some interim path by which we can say, all right, well, you don't want it in your backyard, we all get it. Nobody wants it in their backyard. But if we were going to do this, what are the factors, what are the principles we follow so that when that time comes, we can point back at this dialogue? So I don't know, that's just some thoughts.
I believe that that's already the direction that staff is going in throughout the entire community, because the whole community is seeing transition and change. And even though you have some people that recognize and want to see diversity in their community, you still have a lot of areas that want to see what they currently have. So that will be the conversation throughout the entire city, not because if I attend a meeting in South Charlotte, it should be the same meeting or very similar to the meeting that I attend in Northwest Charlotte.
I don't know, Madam Chair, I'm just curious because I think, well, the one unifying factor that I've noticed in my little 7-month stint here is nobody wants anything in their backyard, literally, no matter what the topic. But wouldn't the conversation on this be a little different between those who are in areas where it is said no, it's no more can come here, versus those who absolutely are wide open and it hasn't happened? I mean, it would be a slightly different conversation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation is going to be different wherever we go, right? And depending on who we talk to. What I would add to you, Mr. Bakari, you raise an interesting point. And I was teasing earlier, I said I'm going to be out in front of this train. We're going to be out in front of this train. If you all have intact groups that are already occurring, I'm happy to avail myself to come to those meetings, right? I think the more community engagement we can do on the front end, the better off we'll be. I know there are things that, Mr. Harlow, all of you will probably have intact groups, obviously the neighborhood groups, but there are forums like there are Rotaries, there's the Tuesday morning breakfast where a lot of people come.
South Park Association of Neighborhoods.
Yeah, so if we start testing this, let's just do it. So I just wanted to put that out there. Just, Gail, she has full access to my calendar. Let's just try to do as much on the front end as we can.
Yeah.
And I'm not foolish enough to believe everybody's going to be happy about this, but I think this is a step in the right direction, and I would submit that it adds more clarity than what we have now.
Ms. Campbell, ask a question before we wrap up. Staff still wants the opportunity to take no policy and a policy with revisions out to the community. Are you all comfortable?
No, ma'am.
With that? Okay.
No. Even though what we're saying today on the agenda is that we don't have, I think what you're looking for is a nod from us between the two. So if I'm hearing correctly from my colleagues and from the conversation, the support is around a policy, a more defined, and a policy that's more reflective of today, not to go to the community with no policy, but around how do we identify a policy that's going to be effective. Mr. Eggleston?
I agree, but just as a curious human being, I'd be interested to hear your case for why that is something that should be kept on the table.
As a curious human being?
I mean, I don't agree with you, but I'm interested to hear why you feel that way, or why you think that should be considered as an option.
The only reason that it was brought originally as an option is because we've heard from the community that why do you have a policy that essentially tells poor people where they can live or can't live? And so it was almost like a response to what we've heard from the community.
But that's why we have the opportunity, because at some point, the responsibility.
I'm not,
right.
Please,
but
I'm not advocating.
Right,
I'm
but there's a
simply
level
trying to be
where
responsive.
council has a responsibility to make sure that we're educating our
Absolutely.
districts and educating our community and being prepared to answer those questions. But when we go out and talk about what this locational policy is, it will still make more sense to preface it and start the conversation with, this is what a no policy would look like, opposed to opening up the door for a long conversation down the road of no policy versus how do we strengthen and how do we create more opportunities with a locational policy? What is our goal with having it? It changes the conversation when you try to go out, because community members are on a different level.
Sure.
Some people are more engaged regarding housing and locational, some are not, so only thing you hear is this soundbite. Let's not make it unnecessarily difficult. Let's provide all the information, but I think it still would be much more beneficial for what we're trying to attempt, and that is to create something that's going to be beneficial long run and not just for the next year and a half.
I just wanted to make sure that we understood what the community is.
Madam Chair, I think that argument's a lot more valid that you just raised from the community if the policy is only punitive in nature, like we talked about
earlier.
If there is a carrot, it becomes a lot less of a meaningful argument, because while it's a fair point, it's more than just that.
So can I just ask one more clarifying question? I want to make sure. So are we essentially, I know, Mr. Driggs, it's not what I promised you. Are we essentially taking the option 2 out as a draft, since we're eliminating option 1? I just want to be clear.
We're kind of tentatively pushing option 2.
We are,
Pushing
we
option 2
are
forward.
from committee, and I will ask again to make sure that we all are in support together. So we are supporting option 2 and creating the community conversation to see how we can strengthen this.
Around
And
option 2?
2.
Okay.
Mr. Driggs.
I just want to be sure that the full council understands that we are headed in that direction and that nobody feels excluded. So yes, that's what this group says, but we can't kind of completely drop option 1, I believe, without hearing from others, because that's a big step.
It is.
Could be for some.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you want to do that, or whether we communicate that this is the outcome of this meeting, and we just share that information and give others the opportunity, if they want to weigh in. But I don't want to kind of get down the road and have somebody else on council say, hey, you know, what about this possibility?
That's a great point, Mr. Driggs. Let's talk about how we inform the full council.
Figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
And we'll
we start
have
the
further conversation to see what that really looks
input
like.
process.
Because also it can be done in a dinner briefing to give the update, but the reality is, we have a short timeline. We're in July, we have a November bond conversation, and what the community wants to know is what is our plan when we're coming to them and asking for them to support this bond issuance. They want to know what is the goal and what is the plan of how we're attempting to move our community forward and create as many opportunities for as many people. And when we look at what is the area, what is the number, which is why I need those numbers back for Charlotte, because we still have families who are earning $10,000 annually. Today, we still have $600 rents. Those homes, those units are being purchased quickly and flipped. Those new prices are coming in at $1,000 or more. That is more than double. So we need to make sure that the community feels comfortable that we are working very diligently to try to address the real needs that's happening right now. Ms. Wyman and then Ms. Douglas.
Well, Mr. I'll defer to you, but I'll come back.
Well, at the risk of reopening or extending this meeting too long, a friend of mine just whispered in my ear a fair point, and though I disagree with the idea of eliminating a locational policy completely, we have had discussions in other realms of our work of late about the community not always feeling like they knew what all options were on the table from the beginning, and that decisions get made and then presented as opposed to options being laid out to the community, and then they help guide the decision-making process. So while I am personally with the chair in saying that I would be uncomfortable seeing the locational policy removed, there is a point to be made too around community discussion and not feeling like things are taken off the table before the community, outside of the handful of people committed enough to be in this room today, we're even aware of them.
That is always the challenge of being an elected official. Because at the end of the day, the reality is we were elected by the people to address a number of these concerns and try to weed through them, and also try to figure out that balance of transparency and community impact. So that's what staff will be working on, trying to identify that balance. But I also don't want to mislead the community in conversation and spend too much time going down a path that really isn't going to be beneficial. Because you're going to always have someone to say no. At the end of the day, what we really need to get to is how do we create as many opportunities for yes, even if that's a yes with chagrin, how do we get there?
I think, I think it is also doing exactly what you just said, Mr. Eggleston, what you all have just said in terms of, if you compare and contrast no policy with having a policy, I think we all know that having a policy, there are some other advantages of having the policy, because it really helps the council, the community, the developers know and understand what your priorities are from a locational perspective. So if we think about this again as just more a location, where are there opportunities rather than, again, it being punitive of where we don't want you to go or where we don't want you to be. It's more where we want you to be and where there are other opportunities other than housing. There are other opportunities and what this is leading towards. And that discussion, we hope, will help us convey why a policy may be better than not having a policy and just free market, you go where you want to go.
Okay. Ms. Wyman.
So I just want to make sure I leave here with clear direction. We're taking both, are we taking both options out, or are we taking just option 2?
We've already said.
I think what the committee has said is that they looked at the option of a no policy. They think that having a policy is the best direction to go. I think we can accomplish that by saying the committee looked at that.
Well, I think it,
And that's where it is addressed when we go out.
Okay.
So that we are very clear about what it is that we're moving out. We can address that and say committee did discuss it.
That's right.
And now what we're looking at is how do we strengthen this in a way that's going to benefit and address our goals? But we need to be very clear, and staff needs to be clear around what those goals are. So when we go out to the community and start the conversations, we can be very clear, because a number of times communities have been a part of conversations, but then what was eventually implemented was not a reflection of what was identified in community. That was many years ago, but we have an opportunity of making sure that we've identified our goals, and in our goals, we're trying to get as much input as possible. Mr. Bakarian, we're gonna wrap up with you.
I would just say that from my own personal perspective, it's hard to answer that right now without seeing how you've pushed the envelope with the policy.
Okay.
Because we've had this debate many times, and for me, at least, there are two major underlying factors we're trying to solve here. Number of units. This is the crisis, heads in beds, over 20,000. Then locational. This is the longer-term upward mobility play. So both are problems. Both must be solved. But if you're just going to do one, well, no policy, right? Number of units, let's make as many as we can and not care where they are. Or if you're just going to do the other one, we're not going to care that much about that. We're going to care about where they are and the longer-term upward mobility impact. So it just depends how perfectly you craft the policy if a policy is indeed right. So, I mean, I think it would be impossible for us to say, unless we see how you push the envelope of the policy, to know that a policy balances it versus no policy at least does one, right? Versus a super strong policy does the other. So I can't tell you.
That's why we paid them big bucks.
Yes.
So unless we have any other comments, our next meeting is scheduled for August 15th. So with that,
Should we give them an
I
informal head
have
nod?
a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Thank you all for joining us
Last
today.